Hello, everyone. I'm John Huco, the General Secretary of Rotary International, and I'm going to thank you for joining us for another episode of Rotary Responds Live. Every Wednesday for the next several weeks, we'll talk with leaders from the Rotary world and beyond on how they are staying connected and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic in their community. And we'd love to hear from you too, so please let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, the guest for this week's episode is from our disaster partner, Shelterbox. Shelterbox is an international disaster relief organization that got its start as one Rotary Club's Millennium Project in Cornwall, India. So Shelterbox and Rotary have deep roots going back to Shelterbox's foundings. So with that, I'd like to welcome to this edition of Rotary Responds Live the CEO of Shelterbox, Sanj Srikanthan. Sanj, welcome to Rotary Responds Live.
Hello, John. Thank you for having me.
Sanj, perhaps we can start. Could you just maybe tell us a little about yourself and your background?
Well, I'm also relatively new to Shelterbox. I started in December 2019, but for the last 20 years, I've worked all over the world in a variety of different roles. I began my career as a British Army officer and really shaped by my experiences there. I pursued a career in humanitarian relief, studying in Colombia and in Paris, before joining another aid organization called the International Rescue Committee. And there I worked in emergencies from Mali to Liberia to Syria and South Sudan and Lebanon and Iraq, a lot of different places. And I got to see some of the work of Shelterbox from IRC, and particularly in Haiti, one of my first responses, where I saw these tents going up where communities had lost their homes and had less than nothing. And this strange logo on these tents, and more appearing all over, whilst a lot of others were just talking about doing something. There was this organization doing so much for the people of Haiti. And it's really been an exciting opportunity to take over and join this great team and now be at the forefront of a response to this terrible virus that's affecting all our lives.
Well, perhaps, Sanj, for people who are watching who might not know about Shelterbox, can you explain the relationship between Shelterbox and Rotary?
So as you say, Shelterbox was formed 20 years ago this year by some Rotarians in Cornwall, England, who looked at what happens after disaster and how can we help as Rotarians to help people get back on their feet and get that first step to recovery. And one of the largest areas that is underserved, under-resourced still today is shelter and providing a roof over a family's head when they've lost everything. And how can you ask a family to begin that long road to recovery when they don't even have that? So they set themselves up and they started to fundraise, and then they started to respond from Gujarat in India to now Cameroon and Syria and Somalia, to Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands. We are providing that first bit of aid that helps families get back on their feet. And it's been a really exciting partnership. Rotarians remain the largest single group of volunteers as responders, as fundraisers, as ambassadors in our mission. And we hope that there's more partnership to come.
No, I mean, it's certainly been a great partnership and doing great work together. And so, as we kind of deal with this tragedy that's unfolding, this coronavirus pandemic, what role do you see emergency shelter and Shelterbox specifically playing in this coronavirus pandemic?
Well, the word unprecedented has been used extensively when talking about coronavirus, but let's be clear, it's affecting all of our lives, all of our communities, and Rotary clubs all over the world are looking at how they can help those local communities around them, and that's entirely right. But I can promise you that there are parts of the world that are in a much worse situation than you or I. In Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, there are 31 ventilators for the entire country. In the United States, we know that there are currently 38,000 tests per million people. In Yemen, there are 30 tests per million people. So in these countries, if there is a widespread transmission of coronavirus, people will die on a much bigger scale than we can possibly imagine. And although the cases are still relatively few in these countries, we have to prevent them becoming of pandemic proportions, as we've seen in parts of Western Europe and the United States. And shelter plays a critical preventative role. If you can't isolate with your family, you are more likely to spread the virus. If you can't keep your hands clean, and hands are a major source of transmission, you're more likely to spread the virus. So Shelterbox has quickly pivoted to provide extensive shelter now in places like Syria, in Cameroon, in Somalia, and also in Philippines and in Vanuatu, to help those families isolate and keep their loved ones safe. And by doing that, we're helping stop the spread of the virus. And let's remember that if it's spread from a market in Wuhan in China, it can spread from a refugee camp somewhere in the world, or after a disaster when people are crowded together in collective shelters. So this is saving lives on a daily basis. And shelter will continue to be one of the key tools that health practitioners are going to say will save lives and prevent them being overwhelmed with coronavirus cases.
Well, just as Shelterbox has kind of sprung into action, I think so our Rotary clubs around the world have done the same, quickly pivoting their projects to, support communities dealing with the new reality, living, new reality of living through a pandemic, from safely providing personal protective gear to delivering food to those who can't leave their homes, supplying hospitals and clinics with needed equipment and beyond. I think our clubs have really developed innovative ways to continue serving their neighbors in a safe way. And of course, many with the help of the Foundation's disaster response grants. But not all Rotarians and Rotaractors are experts in disaster relief. And I think that's why I think the partnership is so important, because it really allows our members to make a huge difference in these disaster zones. So I guess with that in mind, how can Rotarians and Rotaractors, as people of action, help right now? How can they help right now?
Well, I'll let everyone watching this into a little secret. Humanitarian relief is not rocket science. And for many, it's evident what you need to do in your local communities. But what we provide as Shelterbox, as Rotary's disaster relief partner, is a bit of structure and some guidance, almost a toolkit, if you will, for Rotary clubs in how you can get involved and what you can do. The fundamentals of a coronavirus response are the same, and they're broadly the same as an Ebola response, which I was part of in Liberia. We have to test, we have to trace, we have to isolate, and we have to treat. Much of that requires health practitioners, which we may not all be, but actually much of it requires a community response. So we've got to get the right messaging out to communities, and the Rotary Network is hugely valuable in getting the right public health messaging out there. We need materials, PPE, and shelter, of course, to help those families to isolate. We need to support hospitals like Shelterbox is doing in the Philippines, providing tents so that testing can happen outside of a hospital rather than bringing coronavirus into the hospital. So Rotary clubs, wherever they are, can get guidance from us in how you can get involved and how you can respond, not just to coronavirus, but also natural disasters, because the world is still turning and disasters are happening, like in Bangladesh only this week. So both the chronic emergencies as well as the acute crisis of coronavirus is something you can do something about. And we're here to help guide you and support you in that. And shelterbox.org is the place to find out more.
Well, we're very fortunate. We've got a lot of folks participating from around the world, and we're getting a few questions from them. So Edmund from Ghana asks, how can people get involved with Shelterbox, other than volunteering in the field after a disaster?
Well, it's true. One of the ways you can respond is by becoming a response team volunteer and joining our staff in an active response and distributing aid. But of course, that's a considerable time commitment and not one we can all make. But there are many other ways that are equally powerful, impactful, that you can get involved in. One of them is, of course, to fundraise as a club for Shelterbox and fundraise towards the items of a kit, stocking the box, as it were, and buying individual items that will then get put into a kit to deliver to a family after a crisis. There's also becoming an ambassador. It's really important in these times when there's so much messaging out there, so many things that are drawing our attention, that we have you as genuine voices and ambassadors as Rotarians talking to your communities, to other Rotary clubs, and we help let you know about what we're doing, how we're responding, so you can pass the word and encourage others to support. But also, clubs around the world have helped us for the last 20 years to be more effective, to deliver at scale and at speed and with impact. We could not have responded in Bangladesh without Rotary clubs there who've helped us to get aid in that much faster, to get visas. In Tanzania, the clubs there have identified where the flooding is occurring so we can get the aid where it's needed to much faster, but also helped us with permission from the Tanzanian government to operate. In Vanuatu, in Somaliland, in other places, some of the aid has had to go through other destinations, and Rotary clubs have been great facilitators. And in the Philippines, we have a Rotarian who for the last 5 years has been providing us warehousing free of charge, which means we've been able to store supplies that much closer to where we need it in that part of the world. So the ways you can get involved as a club, as an individual Rotarian, are limitless. And we encourage you to get in touch. And for clubs where you might see yourself affected by disaster, get in touch before the disaster so we can get in touch with you and find out what you might be able to do to help. And we can start talking through the scenarios for a future disaster response. And that's really important. So don't just wait for the disaster. Think about when the disaster might occur and get in touch now so we can have a conversation about a more effective response.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the strengths of Rotary is that we have deep roots in just about every community in the world. And that's why I think historically the Shelterbox Rotary partnership has been so effective. And of course, it's all really geared toward helping disaster affected people. And so how do you, what do you think this means for the people from, the disaster affected people in this difficult time? What's it mean for them?
Well, the sad reality is that coronavirus is just one of many threats that families affected by disaster are confronting. So if we talk about Bangladesh only this week, it's really a disaster on top of a disaster. Many communities are facing extreme poverty, but also now facing a cyclone and also facing coronavirus. And these disasters interplay with one another. If you lost your home and you go into a collective shelter, you're more likely to be confronted by many more people in a dense environment and therefore more likely to transmit or catch coronavirus. So I remember a Liberian I talked to during the Ebola response who said, Ebola is just one more thing that can kill me because I can't afford the healthcare that would help me not get malaria or dengue. I can't stop working because then I can't support my families. So shelter and the aid we provide is one of the things that really helps families to reach a new normal around dealing with coronavirus, but also continuing with their everyday lives. The public health messaging around how you can work and continue to support your family with coronavirus, but also isolate with our tents is helping to save lives. We also help connect people to other services, including education for their children, as well as livelihood support, as well as protection for women and girls. That's absolutely critical in keeping people safe, but also to help them continue with their everyday lives. So I know many communities around the world find it invaluable that we are connected to Rotary clubs who in their local communities can connect them to some of these services that go beyond just shelter. I also know that many of these families that are affected by disaster, the last thing they want is a handout. They want to become resilient and sustainable. And the aid we provide is helping them get onto that path to recovery.
Well, we've got a whole slew of questions coming in from our viewers. Katie in Canada wants to know what type of training goes into becoming a Shelterbox Response Team member. In fact, it's some question I've always been wondering. Sanja, what's it take to become a Shelterbox Response Team member?
Well, yes, we talked about responding alongside all the many other things that you can do as a Rotarian. And if you are itching to get involved hands-on in a response, and particularly for the next generation of supporters, there is that desire to feel what it's like to be part of a disaster relief response. Joining our response team is one of those ways. And it is a process that takes time because we do want to get the right people. It can take up to a year from initial application to completing your training. And that is because whilst it's not rocket science, like I said, it's really important that we get it right and we do the right thing by the people we're helping. And we're not looking for people with lots of humanitarian experience. We're looking for what kind of character and what kind of personality you have, because it does take resilience. It does take patience with bureaucracy sometimes. Sometimes you're going to deal with lack of sleep and a lack of resources that you need to work around. Sometimes you're going to deal with frustrations that can feel overwhelming. And we also are looking for leaders, but we're also looking for followers, because it's not always about leading. And sometimes it is about listening to communities and hearing what they want and responding accordingly. But if you have all those attributes and you want to see if you have what it takes, then shelterbox.org, you can see how you go about signing up to be a volunteer and starting that process. There's also a great blog that Rotarians did who joined the response team about what that process looks like. And it certainly begins with an assessment, 4 days in person in field-like conditions, then a lot of online learning that you need to do, and then coming back for a 10-day assessment, which is pretty thorough and pretty intense. But at the end of it, if you're successful, it's great to be part of that community of response team volunteers. They support each other both before, during, and after a response. And they have a lot of stories that they take away with them and are able to talk about. And if you become a volunteer, it's a great opportunity to also go away and become an ambassador and then talk about your experiences and encourage others to support Shelterbox. So those are some of the ways you can get involved.
No, I have to tell you, the response I've gotten from Rotarians through the years who've participated in these becoming a disaster response has been fantastic. So I certainly urge any Rotarian out there or Rotaractors interested to really reach out to Shelterbox and do it. I think it'll be a very, very worthwhile experience for you. So just to wrap up, what are your thoughts for the future of coronavirus for vulnerable families? What do you see as the future?
I think for many of us, it can feel overwhelming, the size of the crisis, how it's impacting all corners of the globe, and therefore wondering, what can we do when so many of us feel vulnerable ourselves? And I really love a quote by Nelson Mandela, who said, it always feels impossible until it's done. And I think that's very true with coronavirus. For Shelterbox, this is just another crisis. It might seem big, it might seem like it's everywhere, but we need to tackle the problem one step at a time, one community at a time, one disaster at a time. If we can help one camp or one disaster-affected community, it's one less place where the virus can be transmitted from. That's one less community that's vulnerable and one more community that's more resilient. And Rotarians have an almost limitless sense of compassion and volunteerism. But also we have communities that have an almost similar limitless sense of resilience. And one of the things that I'm really excited by is connecting Rotary clubs from those who are living amongst communities affected by disaster and those who want to help. And we are the middle guy, if you will, between those kind of clubs. And Mark Maloney has talked about the interconnectedness and growing that global Rotary network. Right. And I think we play a critical part in doing that. And I think for us, we will get on the other side of this coronavirus crisis, I have no doubt, and Shelter will play that critical part. But it's also about thinking about the next crisis and the crisis after that, because there are future challenges that we're all going to face. And the partnership between Rotary and Shelterbox, I do not kid you, will have saved millions of lives because of the power of the network and the sense of community that it creates and the sense of giving that it creates. So I know that communities affected by disaster, when they see the logo of Rotary and the logo of Shelterbox on the kits that we hand out, are curious to know more about what Rotary is about. And all of them feel that sense of a community coming together to help them. And I feel that they feel empowered by this as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Sanj, for joining us for this episode of Rotary Responds Live. I mean, it really was very inspiring to hear from you on how we can stay connected and respond to COVID-19 in a time when really the world needs Rotary and Shelterbox more than ever. And I just want to remind everyone that you can request a representative from Shelterbox to speak at your club meeting through the link that's been included in the comments. So, Sanj, any final thoughts before we wrap this up? Any final thoughts for our audience?
Well, firstly, I think wherever you are, whichever club you're part of, there is a way you can get involved. And we've listed some of those, whether it's being an ambassador, whether it's fundraising, whether it's becoming a responder as part of Shelterbox, or whether it's helping us respond more effectively in your local community, you can make a difference. And one Rotarian, one club, one district, one zone can make an enormous difference. Robert Kennedy said, many people see the world as it is and ask why. I look at a world that never was and ask why not. And so if you're sitting in your club thinking, why not? And why aren't we? Then get in touch, because it can often be the case that we simply don't know what you know. And we'd love to start that conversation about what more we can do and what's the next community we should be helping. And we're door open, listening in, and happy to start that conversation with you at shelterbox.org.
Well, thanks again, Sanj. And I also want to thank our viewers for joining us from around the globe and sharing how they're taking action in their communities. I want to remind everybody that we'll be back next week on June 3rd at 10:30 a.m. Chicago time for another episode of Rotary Responds Live. And you can go to the Rotary Responds Live Facebook event page for more info, or share it with your friends. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week.